So a number of months ago, Pete gave me a ring and asked me if I would talk on this subject, and voluntold me. Is that the right thing to say? Yeah. And I agreed to, and I've kept some notes over the last few months, and then more recently I started to go back to the notes to put something together to talk to you guys about today. And I realised I had enough information for a 2-day conference, and panicked. So wasn't really sure where to take this. So I'm going to just take it on a random meandering path, as I tend to do, if many of you know me, and we'll see how we come out the other end. And again, a lot of things I'll talk about, I'll touch on geographically, and maybe not have the answers necessarily, but maybe some questions for us to think about, for you guys to think about when you get back to your desks. Maybe is the way we'll think about it. Okay. I think one thing it reminded me of when I was reading through everything and see the world changing and all of the madness that's happening. We still have our own. We still have our own things. We need to come back to the basics. At the end of the day, we can get so caught up in the complicated. In clinical trials, this will be a focus on the medicine. Right product to the right patient at the right time. You've got to keep coming back to that. And it's really easy to get caught up in mad, crazy things. So what I'm going to do over the next little while is I'm just going to work my way through a few different areas. The state of play today, some regional areas of interest that I've picked for some reasons, some a little bit random, changing shape of the world, where things clash, and then just a little at the end I've called more, which are maybe just me dipping into some of the notes I've made and pulling out some more random things, okay? I thought the state of play, I started to look at the state of the clinical trials industry at the moment and thinking about change, because the topic today is change. And this is what's happening out there. This is IQVIA's report on the changing state of drugs and who's doing them. And this emerging biotech element is increasing massively over the last few years. A lot of you've worked for very stable, large companies for a long time. But there's a lot of change happening and a lot of very young, naive companies appearing. So do they have the experience to be in the middle of the business that we're in here? And it's very, very clear that they don't. So they're relying on an awful lot of help. They're probably making an awful lot of mistakes. And in the middle of doing all of that, because they're so young, there's so much change happening. And of course, I started to think as well in the middle of this, where are the patients, for these clinical trials that we're doing all over the world? And is the infrastructure there to serve them? I've got a map of the world, and I went down a rabbit hole on this one. When you get the slides, there's that little link on the bottom is from WHO, and I don't know if you've ever been there, but it gives you a map of the world and a whole set of sliders and things you can pick on. And it tells you over the last 30 years where trials have been done, each of the phases, whether they were rich countries, poor countries. And you can play with the data massively and see the size and the shape of how the world's changing in terms of trials. Hugely, hugely interesting. And when you go through that and look at it, and I know we all know this, the bulk of the work, the bulk of clinical trial activity is happening in the United States. It's happening in Europe, and we've got this little donut thing going on here with a sort of a separator out in the middle, the People's Front of Judea, whatever we want to call them these days, yeah. Britain's out on its own a little bit now, the UK, and of course Japan has always been a really important place for clinical trials as well. And a lot of our focus in the industry is on these territories, and has been. And then I kind of look at where other things are happening a little bit and how much interest there is in the world of doing trials in these other spaces. And we find China now is a real emerging location for clinical activity. Central South America, there's quite a lot going on there, and it seems to rattle away fairly quietly. I don't know if you guys feel that, but it does. And then there's this Middle East, North Africa area, which I've highlighted. And I couldn't get to the bottom of this, and I think I'll have a go another time. When I'm working and looking at that WHO slider scale, Iran, there are an enormous amount of clinical studies being conducted in Iran. Is anybody in this room doing anything in Iran? And then I went to have a look at the Iran ministry to see, are they highlighting clinical studies in a way that's different to the way that we would expect, but they're using the same definition that the rest of us are, allegedly. That's their headline. So I don't know what's happening there, but maybe there's an opportunity for our companies to look into that country a little bit. Politics aside, don't know. And then we've got areas that I'll talk a little bit about Africa in a while, but I'm not going to touch on India much today. But India, there's a lot happening in India too, or maybe it's a bit forgotten as well. It's now the most populous country in the world. We could and should be doing a lot more in those countries, in that country for those people, and I'm not sure we are. Okay, so I'm going to sort of work through randomly some regional aspects. Again, thinking about the conference a little bit and change and what's changing and what's going on. And looking at it from, it's the glasses I wear. I maybe should have said at the start, working for Almac Clinical Services, we're headquartered in Northern Ireland. So when the Brexit hokey cokey, we're kind of one leg in, one leg out. And the politics of that are all good fun, but this is where we're located. But when we're looking at the way that we're handling medicine and all of the companies we work with hundreds of organizations conducting clinical trials. Didn't start trying to watch how are the supplies changing? Are we really starting to see good, fast adoption of the clinical trial regulation ways of working? That single application, that easier way of packaging potentially. And we're not just at the moment, there's so many trials that are ongoing and trials run for such a long time. We've so many medicines that are packed, sitting, waiting to go to patients or about to be manufactured and packaged to go to patients. And we've got until January next year before existing trials have to transfer over to the new way of working. And we're starting to wonder and get maybe a little bit of Brexit deja vu, that come October time, everybody's going to panic and look at their partners internally or externally to package, label in a different fashion for them and try and get it all done in time. I'm not sure about that one, so maybe that's something for you to think about when you go home. Where you sit in that continuum with the medicine that you're handling today if you work in this space. Interestingly as well, it's kind of funny, the UJAC number on CTIS, the information system, have you noticed the two little numbers in the end? Yeah, some have, some haven't, and some people like to put the clinical trial number on their labels. So you maybe want to rethink that a little bit, because that's just a version number that keeps seeming to change every time you do something. So you could get yourself in a little bit of annoyance with that. I don't know, maybe other people are handling it different ways. Duncan, you're nodding there, so you can maybe share some thoughts on that perhaps. And then just a little bit at the bottom about the ICH D6, the changing look at GCP there. It's quite an interesting document, and I would encourage you to look at the MHRA blog, where it was Andrew Fisher, wasn't it, that wrote a very, very extensive assessment of the way that this was going to change. It's well worth reading. It's quite a long read, but it's pretty good. So you see today, I'm not going into the regulations too deeply today at all, because I figure you guys are all experts and you can all read. All right. Okay, the world didn't end. Sponsors have learned to adapt. Right, so this is a statement and it might be provocative, so we'll see. The UK verification process is working. Is it, from your perspective? Managed it, it's going okay? All right. Well, we feel it's working from our perspective, but then again, of course, we do sit in Northern Ireland, so we're able to sort of go a number of directions with the activities that we conduct. This framework has provided a good deal of stability and support for the companies that we work with. It's really, really important that we're able to give that guidance and support to all of the companies. And I think the UK government have been very, very helpful in that. They really have to try and make sure this has worked. I think the hard bit about QP verification that we're seeing in some cases is the movement of medicine to patient sites and having to make sure that the temperature on arrival of those before the medicine's used, that little QP element is maybe a little bit awkward, and the IRT systems are maybe struggling to adapt with that. So companies are working in different ways to get around that little hurdle. In terms of Brexit itself, we have our main facility in Northern Ireland, and we've got another one in the Republic of Ireland, which we built, during that whole panic after 2016. And we work with all of the sponsors to try and locate their European medicine in an appropriate place based on their own responsibilities. If they're actively working on their QP activities themselves, or they're asking us to support it. And we find that we're still doing an awful lot inside the UK, inside GP. So this notion that, that clinical research has fallen badly away in the UK isn't so much the case. We're still shipping 8 to 10,000 shipments a year to GB sites, and that's not 8 to 10,000 individual patient packs. Those are clinical shipments, which could have quite a lot in them, but maybe have one. So there's still a lot happening going to those sites. And the Ireland facility, then we use largely the Ireland facility when medicine is maybe not going to GB, but will go more widely across the European Union. All right. So the number one shipping location for us for clinical trial medicine in Europe as to which country do you think? Somebody put it out. Spain. Spain's the number one. Okay. France number two, and then out of our Craigavon site, UK is joint number two along with France. Spain's the number one location where we're sending all this medicine. Lots of UK consultations happening at the moment. I think if you've looked at all, you'll see document after document appearing from the government, really recognising that they're continuing to just want to make the UK attractive again and maybe get the reputation back a little bit. But we do know, and Rachel alluded to it earlier, that some of the activities and the agencies are quite slow now. Some of the clinical trial approvals and getting drugs to patient, like the average was like 271 days from packing the medicine to get it to first patient, and it's just too long. But they're trying to change, but they are struggling. And I looked at the MHRA's strategy, the next 3-5 year plan. I usually don't go into it in great detail, but the constant undercurrent through that document is its people and trying to attract and retain people. Rachel mentioned that earlier, and when we were drinking coffee beforehand, we talked about it a little bit. The agency can't pay anymore. You guys are just far too expensive. Years ago you weren't, but now you've all become very expensive. Going to bounce over to Japan a little bit. Japan, good, stable country to conduct clinical trials. In terms of change in that territory, maybe not too much happening at the moment. A little bit of a focus on the act that they had a few years ago because of a falsification scandal. So they're quite focused as a nation on the ethics of conducting clinical trials at the moment and making sure the clinical data is valid and assessed deeply. Okay, so that's quite a big bit there. But working there, continuing to support companies in that country. Japanese people do like to work with Japanese people. I think we all know that, and that really hasn't changed. The United States, the SCSA, that element of tracking and tracing medicine through to the point of use has been a real struggle for the country. And the clinical supplies side of the world, when we buy commercial medicine for comparator use or rescued concomitant use, it's trying to work out how are we going to meet the needs of that act. And the agency has pushed it away a little bit with enforcement discretion for the next year or so, while the industry tries to play catch up and work out where it sits in the middle of that. So we, working in the supplies arena, still need to work out a bit like that serialization way of thinking. We need to try and work out where we fit into that party appropriately, and that's not truly clear just yet. They've recognized in the States that their trials process, it's slow, it's cumbersome, it's old school, but they're trying. I think, Rachel highlighted that earlier, or was it Pete? Highlighted that earlier, that they really are trying to change now, and they're pushing out a chunk of papers and trying to get industry to react and think better. And there are two of them mentioned there on the bottom. I'll touch on the decentralized trials bit a little bit later, but they're trying hard. China, quite a lot of change happening in China. I know it's something we were quite focused on as an organization, and then COVID kind of got in the way of it a little bit. But the landscape is changing, and it's changing rapidly. That leadership, that Congress that issues the laws that everything else flows from, they're thinking more about medicines now. When you see the drug laws, they are more Western looking, certainly. Little bit of a hassle sometimes with some of the laws to try and get access to them in English. That's probably still a little bit hard, but the high level stuff you can get in English. You know, the NMPA then take that law and then run with it, and then locally in each region across China, then they implement it to the best of their ability, or maybe locally politically. And I think that's a real challenge that we'll continue to see in the country in clinical trials for the next while. What's written versus what is applied locally will continue to be a challenge. And we find that when we're working and looking at China in terms of medicine and the changing face of trials and the ways of working, we're seeing Chinese companies conducting trials in China needing to change now and adopt to the new GMP world, frankly, stronger GMPs. They're trying to learn that. And then Chinese companies are looking much more towards the West now and pushing their medicine towards the West. So we're talking to many more Chinese companies than we've ever done before, conducting trials in Europe and the United States in particular. And then we have a lot of our Western companies, you know, seeing that rise of the middle class in China and wanting to get medicine into that country, and then conduct trials in that country as well because of the sheer size of the population and the type of population that it is. So there's a lot going on there. And we find that the Chinese element, it's probably the hardest territory that we've worked in and will be for the next few years. And as we grow more in that country, and I think the companies that I speak to find the same as well, you've got your business language as a company that you're used to. And then what language you're going to have to use in your pharmaceutical quality system in China. I saw something yesterday that says 0.5% of the population of China speak English in a meaningful way. So the people that you hire, the people that you talk to, you work with your partners, what language are you going to use with them? And then your systems themselves, your electronic systems that we use, because we're embedded now in all of these electronic systems, what language is that going to be in? So for me, I can't get to the bottom of it just yet. Where is this sweet spot going to be? Because as a company, as a Western company, maybe trying to do more in China, the more you do in English, the harder it is to do locally. And the more you do in Chinese, the less you have a clue what's going on. So it's going to be really, really hard just to find the right ways of working. And cultural fit of staff is going to continue to be really, really important. So I think you'll probably find the same. Africa, right. I've largely ignored. Is that a fair statement? That WHO thing would suggest that in terms of clinical trial activity, it is largely ignored. And where it's not, people like South Africa, it's a sort of a modern Western feeling country. There's an element of sort of an impression of more understanding from our perspective. So we tend to move a lot of medicine into South Africa and use that as the base then to ship to the clinical trials around the continent. But we have a very Western view of the size of Africa. You know, the Mercator projection, the maps that we all see exaggerate the sizes of some countries and shrink others. And I found this a few weeks ago and I thought it was really interesting. They took some countries around the world and actually placed their true size into Africa. And it surprised me when I saw it collected that way with the United States, India, the whole of China, Spain, France, Germany, Italy, and the whole of Eastern Europe, all fitting into Africa as a continent. And we're sitting as Westerners moving medicine into that country to conduct trials and trying to get it to the right place. And we're starting to find now that using South Africa as a base, well, Belfast is as close to the northern part of Africa as South Africa is. So we're starting to think of different ways of moving medicine into the country. And of course, the climate and the continent it varies enormously. So trying to get the right medicine to the right people in the right condition continues to be a challenge. So focus on that a little bit if that's something that you're thinking about. But we are seeing more trials starting to appear there, tending to look at African diseases a little bit. So malaria is one example of where companies are really trying to solve that problem, for example. So we're shipping more medicine there. But again, you know, sometimes struggling a little bit to manage the various countries and their customs arrangements and things. So moving some of the medicine and not so much the GMP activities, it's often the other regulations that are the hard part to navigate for us. political upheaval. So there was a bit of politics in there, and you know, it's political upheaval. It's the new norm. We see it every day. You know, our business continuity processes now, we're starting to build them into our pharmaceutical quality system much more because we're having to deal with things so often and change the plan changes and the unexpected deviations, whatever you want to call these things, are all kicking in big time now as we sit down in teams. And we've established, I don't know if your companies are the same, but this gold, silver, bronze way of thinking is a very solid way of structuring your business continuity activities. So if you Google that, if you've not done it, it's well worth doing. And you'll find you should have your quality staff in the middle of that, and making sure that how you react to things, your PQS is working and keeping up. Russia and Belarus, that was a big deal for a while. And I think it's fair to say that we're not seeing a lot of trials happening there at the moment, where we've moved away from the territories. Finding the existing patients are maybe a little bit hard to support to get the medicine to them. And even, trying to get the medicine into the country, who do you use to get it into the country? The restrictions are quite serious now. And you fall foul of other regulations. Again, temperature monitors and shipments. We've had to dismantle the temperature monitors to make sure there isn't a chip in there that the United States hasn't put on an embargo list. So you're having to think about things that you've never had to before. It's really strange. Ukraine, then, part of the same political challenge. For us, that's just one of trying to find the right patients in the right place, because the population for a while there had to move around the country quite a lot, and it was a little bit uncertain, and we had to keep patients on medicine. So you have to be a little bit creative with these things, a little bit stretchy in the way you work. And then, of course, I've had to introduce a whole new thing at the bottom of the slide, all of a sudden from nowhere. Israel, and what's happening there. Very, very quickly, the airlines all shut down. So our medicine gets in on El Al only. And you can imagine the competition for space on those planes. Very, very hard to negotiate space. And like a lot of things, space is a commodity you pay. So the fact it's a medicine doesn't really matter to the airline at the end of the day. You're using up space in that airliner, you need to pay more. And then inside the country, Spain or Israel has a QP certification process, very like the European Union. And the way that they are able to move medicine around the country, and get medicine to patients is fairly restricted by legislation. So we're working very closely with the QP partners that we've got in the depots in Israel, and then using them to negotiate directly with the Ministry of Health to get some exemptions to move medicine to patients. So that's just normal. It's new, but it's normal. What's next? Anybody got a country they're particularly worried about? And help me for next week. Just a little bit. I'll move quite quickly through a couple of these slides. Just the changing state of studies in general is making us think a bit harder. Our studies are much smaller now. They're much more targeted in populations, and we have to get the medicine to the patient quicker. Everybody wants to do something yesterday. It's the new world that we live in. Regulators are having to move faster, but everybody learned to move a bit faster during COVID, which was not the worst in the world. We've had to get there a little bit quicker. Medicine, the changing formulations, medicine's got colder and colder and colder. So in the trials business, from the packaging, the shipping business, the confirmation business upstream and downstream, we're working very hard now with the state of medicine. Regulatory documents, is so much change in the regulatory documents. Supply chains are changing all the time. Your supply chain diagrams, we pick up loads and loads of them because we work with so many people. Companies do not know in a formal way where their activities are happening. And that's a terrible statement to have to make from standing here. The amount of supply chain diagrams that we pick up, and then IMPDs that we pick up, that do not match the batch records and the CFAs and the other testing documents that we've been given. They just don't match. And the companies are utterly surprised when we go back and speak to them. It's really strange. But my question at the bottom there is your PQS keeping up? The other bits kind of speak for themselves there, but you guys need to get a grip of this, because it's worse than maybe you think. And I've called this one a regulatory awakening. Over the years that we've worked in the industry, we were always very, very concerned. The regulators were very concerned about what's happening at the drug manufacturing site, concerned about where we packed it and labelled it. And then there was a bit of a handoff from GMP towards GDP, then as we moved it on out a little bit. And then the GCP folks and the regulators start to take over a little bit. But now we're carrying on moving the medicine, from the clinics in many cases right to the patient's homes. So the D bit of GXP starts to rear its head again, and then the return at the end of it all the way back for reconciliation activities and destruction. So the regulators are having to join up much more themselves internally and be less siloed than the way they used to be, and that will continue. Decentralized clinical trials. This is the activity of how we get medicine really into patients' homes. And there's a lot of acronyms here, and a lot of ways people are describing it incorrectly in many cases, or we get mixed up. But I would say in the European countries, you can, in most cases, we keep a control tower together. And in most cases, you can move medicine in countries from a clinical site and get it to a patient's home for them to administer in the home. Most countries, you're allowed to do that. The regulations locally permit that. There's no joined up way of thinking in this. But if you think about using your own central holding location, whether that's your own warehouse in Dublin or France, and then do the same, get it directly to a patient's home, going across those EU state borders is generally not allowed at the moment, generally not allowed. So that would be something would be nice to change over the next few years as the patient demand changes for a lot of medicine. And in the United States, it's very permitted. You're allowed to do decentralized clinical trials, but state regulation falls all over this massively, and you get yourself in a terrible state of affairs very quickly. We have spent thousands of hours now working with the individual states in the United States to try and understand how medicine gets to a patient in states, and they all, not all, the bulk of them want a pharmacy license, whether you have one in the state, or they want an out-of-state pharmacy license, and they're looking at it as a dispensary activities. So in your own pharmaceutical quality system, you're used to releasing medicine and then for it to go to a patient. Well, it goes to a clinical site and then to a patient typically. But now when there's a call off for a medicine to go to a patient's home, you all of a sudden need a pharmacist in the middle of it right at the end to do a dispensing activity. And how is that falling inside your quality system? And when that goes a bit wrong, which part of the quality system is dealing with it? So we're having to sort of rejig a chunk of what we do to take account of that new paradigm. Call this one the clash. Top right-hand corner, points for what's that? There you go, somebody's old in the room. The clash, right? So I've just called this page the clash. This is where regulations bump up against regulations. And we're finding all of the time now the customs regulations are falling heavily intertwined with the GMP regulations. And when we move medicine into a country now, into our site, we are being asked by the regulators, what have you imported? And I can't tell you how many people have no idea the answer to that really simple question. What have you imported? What does imported mean? The importer of record, who is the actual importer? And an awful lot of parts of the organization that handle the medicine don't know who the importer is. So we've got to confirm the importation before you conduct the QP certification or confirmation. So we're starting to pull now customs documents into the PQS to have them available at the point of receipt in a way that hasn't existed before in a formal setting. So look at that if you're not looking at it already. And just a little practical example in the United States, we're still seeing companies falling foul of moving medicine into the United States, where maybe they don't have an approved IND for medicine going in and trying to wing it. And the winging it, there's usually a wing missing. And I don't know if any of you guys have dealt with these border people in the States. They get very strict very quickly. I did a few years ago try to solve a problem, and the agent invited me to speak to the President of the United States. Okay. Rachel, you touched on the changing nature of the environmental issues of the world, so heating and everything else. We're going to have to, in our quality systems, and this is not unique to clinical supplies, it's the same for all of us, we're going to have to make some changes fairly quickly and make some really good decisions. We've got all of these aspects that we're changing in our own organizations to meet our own obligations, but we've got upstream partners and then suppliers and downstream providers. and they're all having to make their own changes as well. So you find all sorts of little things happening that have a butterfly effect. A company comes and tells you they've they have a high intensity, energy intensive way of making the glue for labels or labels, and so they've changed the glue and the labels, and now all of a sudden you have no idea will the labels stick to the packs. So you've got to think about things, and they've made the change, and they've told you late because they didn't think it was that important because it's just glue. So we're going to have to react very quickly as quality teams, okay? One just example on the bottom, a practical example, even in energy usage, we tried to soften the use of energy in Singapore by reducing the effort in our primary production area because it's that's very intensive in terms of usage. So we rolled that a way back, and then we introduced a mold problem because of the heat and humidity of Singapore. So we ended up spending far more fixing the problem that we tried to solve upstream. So we're going to have to rethink that again. And maybe that's okay in new facilities that you design, but many of you are going to be dealing with this with your existing facilities. And of course, you're going to have to deal with the famous engineering statement, like for like replacement. All right. You'd be happy to know this is the last bit I'm going to end because I've gone on a little bit. Tech. It's coming on everything. AI. I come from Donegal. AI was something that happened to cows. Right. So this is all changing, and I get a feeling now that if AI had been around a few years ago and you produced a Casio calculator, you'd be selling it as AI. So a bit like we said earlier, everybody's selling everything as AI at the moment. It's going to be hard for us. But in the clinical trials industry, what I would say, I put it in bold, is there's a real drive now, an attempt, and you'll watch it over the next few years, where we're trying to, I call it unifying the data. Just have much more connected information. We're able to see things in a more seamless way, and that will create its own problems. Rachel talked about leaving out certain aspects of data and information, but we're going to have to pull them together. The systems that are created by all these different companies, they're going to have to talk to each other, and our quality systems have to be able to manage those integrations and talking. I've said regulations are bumping into regulations. On the right-hand side, all of a sudden we ended up with medicine we couldn't get into China because a customs guy saw that something was toxic and we didn't have a toxic label on the clinical trial label, and we couldn't get it in and use it in the country. And we're sitting going, we weren't even expecting to be thinking about the hazardous identification labels appearing in that way. Now, we got to the bottom of it and it wasn't quite as toxic as would merit the label, so it was okay. But that's sort of thinking slightly outside the normal way of working as well. Staff, there's the bit at the bottom. This was a telling thing for me when I looked at a McKinsey report that was issued recently. We need better people to do more and more for us, and they don't exist. So what are we going to do about that as an industry to solve all of these problems that we're here to talk about today? I think it's really, really hard. And you guys are all the leaders in your organizations now, so you're going to have to do your best to help those people. Okay? Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. That's the world we live in clinical supplies, and I think it's the same for everybody else. Right, that was a very random discussion of a whole pile of, that was a 2-day conference there that I picked out those points. All right, so I hope you've got some little bits of interest out of that, and thank you for your tolerance of sitting through it. All right, and thank you for London's calling and the clash. That was good.